It's such an honor and also such a huge pleasure to get to talk about a place I've fallen in love with, my adopted hometown, a city that's done me the kindness to adopt me in return. So thanks to the Cultural Landscape Foundation for the invitation, to all of you for coming, and to Nina Marie and Brendan for what's been an amazing series of conversations over the last I guess a couple of months, actually, since we've been thinking actively about today. Nina Marie and Brendan have laid out an analytical history of Toronto's landscape that speaks to the dynamic relationships between intention and accident, or differently said, forces that people do control and forces that they don't. And as part of the background for today's discussion and also for the weekend's field trips, it also seems useful to remind ourselves that those relationships are present all the time in the lived experience of the landscape right now. I say this because even for those of us who are interested in stewardship, in the public realm, in the making and the remaking of the city, the natural and cultural complexity of the urban landscape sometimes dips below the surface of our consciousness. So we forget to look for it. It becomes visible in moments of crisis. For instance, on July 8th, 2013, Nina Marie talked about this flood 2, when 2 hours delivered a huge proportion of the rainfall that had landed on the city over the course of a day in its very, very wettest moment. That was Hurricane Hazel. This is a photograph that turned up on Instagram. It was republished on blog.to, and you can see what happened. Our drainage system, which is a series of ravines laced with engineered infrastructure, was completely overwhelmed because the water arrived much more suddenly than it used to, partly because of climate change, partly because there's so much development upstream in the drainage basin. So forces we don't control, forces we do control. Let's just say that the event got everybody's attention. Downtown was flooded. This is Fleet Street. A commuter train got stranded. The most costly natural, or depending on your point of view, unnatural disaster in the history of Ontario. It was a really compelling, really vivid demonstration of complex conditions and relationships that exist all the time, even on a sunny day like today, right near where we're sitting, that red dot. And I think it's really important to ask how and where we can find that complexity, and then ask ourselves what to make of it as we think about what's next for the city's landscape. So I've got 3 stories about iconic Toronto landscapes and the processes they show us, and the way in which they speak to our intentions and their interaction with all those forces we're not in charge of. They're all stories about pairs of places that we don't always connect, although thanks to Nina Marie, you're all onto this one. 2 of Toronto's emblematic landforms, the bluffs and the islands. So you're seeing on the left-hand side the Scarborough Bluffs, on the right-hand side the Toronto Islands from the early 20th century in both cases. And this is a story about how landforms change over different scales of time. The bluffs, as Nina Marie said, are the product of isostatic rebound as the glaciers left our part of the world 13,000 years ago. So we understand their emergence on a geological timescale. And they're the parents of the islands, which have taken shape in the intervening period as the lake currents erode the cliffs and drag them bit by bit by bit by bit along the shallow margin of the shore. The red box on your right is the bluffs. The box on your left is the islands, both along the shore of the lake. I should say today's shore of the lake, because there are actually 3 shorelines on this aerial. The red line, which shows you the remnants of Lake Iroquois, where the city ended until the early 20th century before the big landmaking projects that Brendan described. And then the shoreline we know now, the one you'll see when you walk around on the field trips this weekend. Part of what's interesting about the islands is not only how they were made, but also that they're changing on a historical time scale, the scale that includes the emergence of the city. And changes come from different forces. A pair of big storms in the 1850s, when the city was young, that severed that arm connecting the islands, what we now know as the islands, to the mainland and to the bluffs. This you can see in the bottom map, how that line of the sediment being dragged from the bluffs to the islands is so clearly articulated. The islands have also changed in historical time because of the cultural remaking of the landscape. The St. Lawrence Seaway brought us the Leslie Street Spit, officially known as the Outer Harbor East Headland. And as Nina Marie said, that interrupted the migration of sediment to the islands, so that now, without reinforcement, they would actually gradually wash away. So a couple of things about what that means for us at the scale of everyday experience. For one, every wave that gets your feet wet when you walk your dog on the beach is carrying the bluffs in the direction of the islands. And for another, I think it calls to mind questions about persistence and disappearance and about what that means for inhabitation. So funny enough, on the islands, which we no longer see as ephemeral, places that were built almost as camps, as summer cottages, are now lived in all year, or at least they will be till the lake level gets too high. And on the bluffs, which looked so substantial, so eternal really, houses that were built to last are actually now falling off the edge of the cliff. Another story about the addition, subtraction, and inhabitation of landforms in a kind of an inverse. Here, the geomorphological instigators are people, but the inhabitants that we've come to value most highly actually aren't people. And I'm talking about two places that have come up both in Inverriestock and in Brandon's, the Don Valley Brickworks and the Leslie Street Spit. So the Brickworks produced an enormous fraction of the material that built the city. It operated for nearly 100 years, both as a quarry and a manufacturing center, until it was taken over by the Toronto and Region Conservation Authority at the end of the 1980s because of its presence in the Don River floodplain. The Leslie Street Spit was an ancillary project to the St. Lawrence Seaway, which had suggested the need for a bigger harbor at Toronto. And the Seaway opened in 1959 as Toronto's downtown was being remade. And the new headland began to emerge from the debris of the demolition of the old building. So there's a kind of interesting conjunction of events, the need for a bigger harbor, or a need that didn't actually materialize, but was foreseen, and then the excavation of earth for all these high-rises and the demolition of all those brick buildings that gave way to the high-rises. So again, the Brickworks and the Spit today, they're both along the route of the Don, funny enough. As the Upper Don turns into the Lower Don, is where the Brickworks is, and then the Spit is near what used to be the mouth. They're connected by two other trajectories again. So for one thing, as I said, a lot of the bricks that came from the Brickworks actually now live on the Spit. It's kind of an amazing place to go for a walk because you see the pieces of the city right there under your feet. And for another thing, each one of these industrial sites has become a really important place for what we call nature in the city. The abandoned Brickworks was turned into a park designed by Michael Huff, and now it's the headquarters for Evergreen, an environmental advocacy organization that you'll hear more about this afternoon from Jeff Cape. The Spit, interestingly, became the site of primary succession, something we almost never have a chance to see. Soil began to form. The area was colonized by birds and plants and animals, and it's become a protected urban wilderness. And on weekends also, as it's a public space, its third name, besides the Spit and the headland, is Tommy Thompson Park. And both of these places operate now under the aegis of the Toronto and Region Conservation Authority, and they're both really important places for citizens to encounter the rest of what lives in the city. So each place, in a slightly different way, is the arena for connection among infrastructure, ecology, and the public. My third story is also about infrastructure and ecology and the public, maybe in the most intimate way possible, because it's about our relationship to the lake and to the water in the lake. It's about two monumental installations without which we couldn't live here in large numbers. One is valorized and visible, that's on your left. It's the R.C. Harris water treatment plant, built in the 1930s. It's a beautiful building, and a really incredible monument that features largely in Michael Ondaatje's novel In the Skin of the Lion about the building of infrastructure in Toronto. It processes our drinking water. And the other one on your right is equally necessary, but not maybe equally well loved. It's the Ashbridge Bay water treatment plant, built in the 1950s, expanded substantially since then. It processes the water we've used and puts it back into the lake. And this pier is actually close together, much closer together physically than the other piers I've shown you. But unlike the other piers, these two places are not nearly equally present in our imagination of the city and our pictures of the city. The R.C. Harris plant, it's the end of the beach, people walk there, it's this incredible monument, it's a destination, sometimes it's open during doors open weekend. The Ashbridge Bay plant is not that far away, and it's not that far from the shore, but it's off the path. It's hard to get there. You really have to try. You can't even really approach it, and it's mostly made known, depending on the day and the wind, through the sense of smell. So how do they work? They're sort of opposite ends of the same phenomenon. The R.C. Harris plant pulls the water out of the lake, it pumps it up the hill, sends it down through a series of sand filters, and then the clean water, without pathogens, gets pumped to taps and spigots all over the city. People do with it what they will, and then after they're done with it, it travels away in drains and pipes to Ashbridge Bay, where there's primary and secondary and tertiary treatment that takes out all the pathogens we've introduced, and then it goes back into the lake. And this is one of the most essential stories I can think of about our relationship to the landscape and about the relationship that every citizen has to ecology and infrastructure. I mean, we don't always think about where our water comes from, we don't always think about where it goes, but as soon as the question arises, it becomes apparent that we couldn't be more closely involved. Those of us who live in Toronto, and actually those of you who are visiting Toronto, we couldn't be more closely involved with the lake, more intimately involved with the lake, more directly, let's say, in touch with it. So 3 different stories about the cultural landscape of Toronto, but in one way or another, they're all about how we can see each other, and I mean the we who are citizens and also the we who are designers and scholars and planners and ecologists, experts, let's say. It's only a start. I think it's only the beginning of a series of a lot of very rich stories about this cultural landscape, but it's meant as an argument for why we should look for more stories like this and tell them very clearly to ourselves as professionals involved in the transformation of a dynamic medium, and also to the range of audiences we want and need to engage in conversation about the metropolitan landscape and its future. And I say that because I believe, and I don't think it's a terribly far out thought, that we all take better care of the places we know we belong to. Thank you.